Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Mikabiridzem. I'm the host, or co-host to be precise, of the 2022 Massena Society conference, along with my dear colleague, Dr. Frederick Schneid of the High Point University. And today we'll welcome you to the first full day of the conference, which will start with the wonderful panel of presenters from the University of North Texas, where they all work on their degrees related to the revolutionary Napoleonic era. And the panel will be chaired by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Mary Robinson of the Lourdes University. So without further ado, Dr. Robinson, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us so early in the morning.
Good morning, Alex. Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Mary Robinson. I'm an associate professor at Lourdes University in Sylvania, Ohio. We're in a suburb of Toledo. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the conference as well. We have an excellent panel of scholars prepared to present their scholarly work to us. And all of these scholars are going to present papers about well-known figures during the First Empire in France, but they also challenge us to look at these well-known figures in a new way and in a new light, and in re-examining their careers and their choices. So our first panelist today will be Christy Deluna. She is a PhD student at the University of North Texas, studying with Dr. Mike Legere. And she is going to be presenting today on Désirée Clary, the wife of General Bernadotte and future Queen of Sweden. So without further ado, Ms. Deluna, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Robinson. I'll be speaking this morning about Désirée Clary. The title of my paper is Désirée Clary, the woman between France.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Deluna. Can you get closer to the microphone so that we can hear you well better? Thank you.
Is that better? I'm sorry, is that better?
I think it's better.
Okay.
A little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have the volume all the way up, so I'm not sure. Well, anyway, good morning. Presenting about Désirée Clary. The title of my paper is Désirée Clary, the woman between France and Sweden. By abolishing the old regime and ending social distinction based on birth, the revolution changed the lives of Europeans in unexpected ways. Similar to the Bonaparte family from Corsica, the Clary family of Marseille took advantage of new avenues of social mobility created by the revolution. Sons and daughters from each family reached the highest pinnacle of power by becoming the monarchs of France, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and Holland. One example, Bernardine Eugénie Désirée Clary, the youngest daughter of the Clary family, met Joseph Bonaparte unexpectedly on 18 September 1793. This accidental meeting altered the destinies of France and Sweden. Désirée, as she was known by family, played an important and often unrecognized role in Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power in France during the coup of 18 Brumaire. She was born 8 November 1777 to François and Françoise Soumis Clary in the turbulent port city of Marseille. Her father, François, accumulated his substantial fortune by insuring ships and trading wheat, fabrics such as silk and other goods in exchange for coffee, spices, and dyes. Marseille's location and geography created a region separate from France that had limited self-government. Consequently, the merchants of Marseille enjoyed greater civic power and social standing in comparison to the rest of France. François Clary served as second alderman from 1764 to 1765, and then in the Chamber of Commerce from 1771 to 1776, and again from 1780 to 1782. Hoping to expand his influence and business interests into other areas in France, François applied for letters de noblesse prior to the outbreak of the revolution. Although François' application became moot with the abolition of the nobility and Declaration of Equality in August of 1789, this document remained on record. later, the issuance of the law of suspects during the Reign of Terror resulted in the arrest of Francois and his son Etienne in the latter half of 1790. The law provided for the arrest of suspects deemed enemies of the revolution, specifically former nobles, or even those who aspired to become nobility, other officials, and hoarders of goods. Francois would kind of fit into that portion that aspired to become nobility and also a hoarder of goods as a merchant. While in prison, he fell ill. He was allowed to return home, and he died on 20 January 1794 at the height of the Reign of Terror. Etienne Clary remained in prison. To secure Etienne's freedom, Désirée and her sister-in-law, Marcel Clary, Etienne's wife, went to the Maison Communale in Marseille to gain an audience with the representative of the people, Antoine Louis Albert. The women entered a crowded room to await an opportunity to plead their case. Désirée fell asleep while Marcel was meeting with Albert to release her husband. In her excitement, she went home to celebrate, Marcel did, leaving her sister-in-law behind. After dark, a strange man woke Désirée and stated that a young lady could not walk home alone on dangerous streets. He then offered to escort her home. At the end of their walk, he announced his name, Joseph Bonaparte, and they agreed that he would return to visit more formally the next day. Joseph Bonaparte understood the social position and the wealth of the Clary family. His background in law led to an administrative position in the local government of Marseille. As a Freemason, he attended lodge meetings alongside the Clary men. Knowledge of the Clary family's precarious situation meant that he knew the Clary women needed protection after their family patriarch's death. The Bonaparte women also remained dependent on Joseph and his brother Napoleon Bonaparte for financial support, which added to his familial burden as the oldest son. Marriage between Joseph and either of the Clary daughters would provide the financial security that would allow the Bonaparte family to return to their former prominent social status and lifestyle. The relationship between Joseph and Désirée progressed, and he proposed within a few weeks. Joseph hoped to arrange a similar marriage between Napoleon and Julie, so he invited his younger brother to visit after his success at the siege of Toulon. After arriving and meeting the Clary sisters, Napoleon easily convinced Joseph to step aside so that he might court Désirée instead. According to Désirée, he said, "In all well-managed households, either the husband or the wife must be the one to yield. You, Joseph, have no decision of character, and neither has Désirée, while Julie I know very well what you want. You will do much better then to marry Julie. As for Désirée," he added, as he took her in his lap, "she shall be my wife." Napoleon's statement laid the foundation for the tumultuous and sometimes inexplicably close relationship between himself, Désirée, Joseph, Julie, and later Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. Out of deference to his more impulsive and decisive brother, Joseph acceded to Napoleon's wishes. Désirée found herself intrigued by Napoleon's forceful method of taking charge. Désirée had never been in love with Joseph, so she found herself captivated by Napoleon with very little effort. The young couple set their wedding date for the spring of 1795. They learned each other's temperaments. They began building their relationship by taking long walks in family gardens. Napoleon initiated the search for a home and land. Désirée and Napoleon attended the marriage of Joseph and Julie in Cuges on 1 August 1794. They planned to marry in the spring of 1795, but their plans for marital bliss were halted by Napoleon's arrest on 6 August 1794. With Augustin Robespierre resulted in him being charged with complicity in the Robespierre brothers' crimes. By 30 August, Napoleon had successfully defended himself and earned his freedom. He determined that the only way to earn full reinstatement of his former position involved traveling to Paris to petition military leadership. On the route to Paris, he attended a luncheon hosted by Auguste de Marmont's father, where he received congratulations on his engagement and asked for advice on properties newly vacated due to the revolution. After their marriage, Joseph and Julie had moved their household to Genoa in an attempt to build their own fortune. They joined her Louis-Nicolas, who had moved there to reestablish the Clary trading empire, and Joseph helped manage the Mediterranean trading operation. Napoleon, who learned about this move, endeavored to profit from Joseph's easy access to goods. He asked Joseph to send him soap, silk, and other hard to find items that could be resold in Paris. While Napoleon celebrated the opportunity to increase his meager income, he remained less than pleased that Désirée had accompanied them. He would have preferred that she stay in Marseille, where he could easily visit her and their relationship could continue. Regardless, though, Napoleon helped his brother to advance his political legitimacy and his community standing by arranging for Joseph to receive a diplomatic posting at Genoa as a French consul. Despite their separation, Désirée and Napoleon corresponded through letters that indicated the seriousness of their relationship. Conversely, this correspondence also documents the tension that led to the end of their engagement. While in Paris, Napoleon attended the salons of Madame de Talleyrand and Madame de Staël, where he was introduced to Josephine de Beauharnais. Their obvious attraction to each other quickly became the center of Parisian gossip, which reached Désirée at Genoa. Distressed by Napoleon's amorous adventures in Paris, Désirée wrote of her undying love and their shared vows concerning commitment. She ultimately reacted by sulking and refusing to communicate. Out of desperation, Napoleon begged her to respond. Receiving no reply, he asked Joseph to relay messages to her. Napoleon found an outlet for his frustrations with their lack of communication in their relationship by writing about what he couldn't verbally express. During this period of his relationship with Désirée, he wrote a fictional novel titled Clisson et Eugénie. Initially dismissed by historians as unfinished fiction, the writing contained obvious parallels to his relationship with Désirée. Clisson is a career soldier who fell desperately in love with a young girl named Eugénie. They married and moved to the countryside to raise their family. He's called away to Paris to serve in the military. An aide-de-camp is sent to watch over his family. Eugénie and the aide-de-camp betray Clisson with an affair, which is the part that isn't accurate. Clisson determines to die in battle so that Eugénie will. Sorry, I got muted somehow. Okay. The end of the novel is eerily similar to a letter sent by Napoleon to Joseph in 1795. If the business with Eugénie is not concluded, and if you do not send me any funds with which to operate, then I will accept the post of infantry general and go with the army of the Rhine to seek my death. Napoleon carried different versions of Clisson et Eugénie with him throughout his life. He continued to edit the document even while held captive at St. Helena. Eventually tiring of a long-distance relationship and the petty squabbles over communication, Napoleon ended the engagement through a letter to Joseph. In a letter sent shortly after his marriage, Désirée begged Napoleon to continue to hold her in his esteem and to not completely forget Eugénie and pity her fate. Despite an initial period of disappointment and anger, each maintained their affection for the other. The marriage of their siblings kept them in close proximity. After Napoleon's marriage to Josephine, he continued to care for Désirée's well-being by attempting to find another suitable marriage for her. In a letter to Joseph, dated 12 November 1797, Napoleon proved that he had not forgotten Désirée by recommending General Léonard Dufault as a suitor for her. Napoleon described Dufault as an excellent man and expressed this belief to Joseph that Dufault will, I think, be a good match for her. He is a distinguished officer. Unfortunately for all parties involved, Dufault died during a riot in Rome on 27 December 1797, while Désirée and Joseph watched helplessly from nearby. Afterwards, Joseph claimed that Désirée and Dufault meant to marry the day after the riot. Désirée firmly denied this statement, stating that she had never had any interest in Dufault and that Joseph only wanted to make him seem more prominent after his death. Désirée's denial of an engagement between herself and Dufault demonstrates an early understanding of political maneuvering to gain higher societal positioning through marriage. Napoleon's next attempt at matchmaking involved his aide-de-camp, Jean Andoche Junot. Junot sent Auguste de Marmont to present his case for marriage to Désirée. She described the proposal to her court chamberlain as he was very awkward about it. He was so timid that he sent Marmont to present his petition to me. Perhaps I should have said yes, he was such a handsome man. But Désirée refused to enter into a relationship with a man that would take orders, especially from Napoleon. Her independent nature and refusal to be molded into any sort of expected behavior became the deciding factor in her acceptance of Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a man known for his defiance of authority in defense of his beliefs. He was the son of a law practitioner who broke family tradition by joining the military. He began his military career as an enlisted soldier known as Sergeant Belgium because of his attention to detail. Despite his inauspicious beginnings in the military, Bernadotte continued to rise in rank during his time in the Army of the Pyrenees. Achieving the rank of Major General, Bernadotte received orders to serve under General Napoleon Bonaparte in Italy in January 1795. On 18 January, Bernadotte wrote to Napoleon with his itinerary and request for supplies prior to crossing the Alps. Napoleon ordered him to travel to Koblenz. Bernadotte questioned these orders, attempting to argue common sense and continuing on his prior route to Chambéry. This habit of questioning orders and interpreting them in a manner that benefited himself became one source of the antagonistic relationship between Napoleon and Bernadotte. Bernadotte met Napoleon for the first time on 3 March 1797 near Mantua, where he assumed command of the 4th Division. Although described as a friendly meeting, the encounter contained a degree of tension due to Bernadotte's previous argument with General Alexandre Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff, over a conflict involving the military commander at Milan. In December of 1797, Director Paul Barras proposed appointing Bernadotte as the commander of the Army of Italy to counteract Napoleon's growing influence. Instead, Napoleon convinced the Directory to send Bernadotte as an ambassador to Vienna, where he failed miserably. All of these incidents contributed to the growing rivalry between the two men. Bernadotte returned to Paris in the summer of 1798 after his assignment in Vienna ended. Joseph engineered a meeting between Désirée and Bernadotte at Mortefontaine, since the two men enjoyed a friendship that was cemented by similar political views. A marriage between Désirée and Bernadotte could only benefit Joseph and, by extension, Napoleon. With Désirée firmly under their influence, Joseph hoped that she would influence her future husband as they wished. From Bernadotte's perspective, an alliance with Joseph gave him support against Napoleon, and an alliance with the Bonaparte family could only enhance his prestige and possibly place him in a position where he might replace Napoleon if the mission in Egypt failed. Joseph expressed these thoughts in a letter to Napoleon that announced the possible marriage between the latter's rival and ex-fiancé. However, before Napoleon could respond, Bernadotte and Désirée had already married within 2 weeks of their initial meeting on 17 August 1798. Not knowing the marriage had already occurred, Napoleon expressed his best wishes for Désirée in a letter to Joseph. "I wish Désirée happiness. If she marries Bernadotte, she deserves it." He did not offer any felicitations to Bernadotte. Like him or not, as Joseph's brother-in-law, Bernadotte became inevitably linked to Napoleon. During their first year of marriage, the Bernadottes lived with Joseph and Julie. While Jean-Baptiste campaigned with the military, Désirée received the support of her sister's household, since she often broke down in hysterical tears when Bernadotte departed. In this way, the sisters' close bond provided an expedient way for Joseph to question Désirée about Bernadotte's actions and words. Before the year ended, Jean-Baptiste moved his wife out of Joseph's home after realizing that Désirée, under the inspiration of Joseph, sought to understand the general's intentions and interfered more than he wished. Hence, Désirée traveled with Bernadotte on his military missions whenever possible. Bernadotte's military career continued to rise. Known as an ardent Republican, a cautious upholder of authority rather than a conspirator, and as somewhat calculating, an opponent of political corruption, he tended to identify with the Neo-Jacobins. On 2 July 1799, Bernadotte became Minister of War after refusing the position twice. The director, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, had offered the position at the urging of the Bonaparte brothers, Joseph and Lucien. Bernadotte was convinced to accept the posting by Désirée and Julie, probably under the urging of Joseph. Shortly after Bernadotte accepted the new position, Désirée gave birth to their only child, Joseph Francois Oscar, on 4 July 1799. Joseph Bonaparte was designated godfather of his new nephew, resulting in renewed closeness between the two families. According to director Barras, when the minister returned home, he always found there allegedly inquiring after Madame Bernadotte's health, the brothers Bonaparte, or at all events, Joseph and his wife. Bernadotte's performance as minister of war, received mixed reviews from the 5 directors. Louis-Jérôme Gauhier and General Jean-François Moulin seemed impressed by his attention to detail. Sieyès commended his speed, but Roger Ducos questioned Bernadotte's political allegiances, especially after a resurgence of Jacobin sympathies in Paris. Although Bernadotte sympathized with the neo-Jacobin group, the Manège Club, he was careful not to be observed taking part in their activities. Fearing that Bernadotte might turn on the Directory, Sieyès tried to convince the other directors to sack him. After failing to do so, Sieyès recruited Joseph Fouché, Minister of Police, to spy on Bernadotte in the hope of catching him committing a criminal offense. Barras convinced them Bernadotte would be willing to resign instead. Sieyès published a letter of resignation for Bernadotte in the Monitor, the Parisian newspaper, and forced Bernadotte to accept the resignation, which he had not given. Bernadotte retreated from society until he became aware of Napoleon's return to France on board La Muiron in October 1799. Napoleon disembarked at Freyeux and traveled by land to Lyon and then Paris, cheered by the citizens as a war hero. Meanwhile, Bernadotte argued that Napoleon should be court-martialed for breaking quarantine laws and for deserting his troops in Egypt. He offered to conduct the arrest himself. Napoleon attended meetings with Sieyès, Roger Ducos, and Barras. The meeting with Sieyès and Roger Ducos occurred on 23 October 1799 at Napoleon's house. The 2 directors hoped to recruit Napoleon's aid in their movement to overthrow the other members of the Directory. They had failed to recruit other generals. Napoleon's meeting with Barras also explored the future of the Directory, but Barras was more worried about how to stay in power and hoped Napoleon would ally. Joseph worked behind the scenes to clear the path to power for his brother. He recognized the influence that Bernadotte carried among the Republican faction and sought to neutralize him by whatever means necessary. Napoleon described this as Bernadotte is not a help, but an obstacle. He said, I believe I shall have Bernadotte and Moreau against me, but Bernadotte has Moorish blood in his veins. He is bold and enterprising. He is allied to my brothers. Bernadotte remained one of the few French leaders with enough influence, courage, and principle to ruin the planned coup. Napoleon asked Joseph and Lucien to intervene. Joseph and Lucien made all sorts of endeavors to inveigle Bernadotte into their brother's party. Moreover, Joseph, Julie, and Désirée all conspired to convince Bernadotte not to intervene in the events of 18 Brumaire, using dinner parties and informal gatherings to bring Bernadotte into contact with Napoleon in a social setting in order to reconcile differences. Despite the pressure of marriage and kinship, the ex-minister of war was still resolutely determined not to be counted as a Bonapartist. Napoleon remarked to his private secretary, Bourrienne, the devil of a fellow is not to be seduced. He is disinterested and clever. Bernadotte successfully avoided having to meet with him until he attended a dinner hosted by Josephine and Napoleon. There's no evidence of Désirée at this particular dinner. However, with Josephine as the hostess, the records basically indicate that the other wives were there also. Bernadotte managed to escape the restraints placed on his wife long enough to criticize Napoleon for abandoning his troops in Egypt. A few days later, Bernadotte arrived unexpectedly at Napoleon's home with Rosalind de Saint-Aubin, who had held the post of Secretary General during Bernadotte's ministry. They argued over the Manège Club. Bonaparte accused Bernadotte of membership and inciting violence, and Bernadotte countered that by claiming that Lucien Bonaparte and Antoine Christophe Salicetti were the leaders who were also connected to Napoleon. And then he left. Their next meeting was at a breakfast hosted by Désirée. And then afterwards, Jean-Baptiste, Désirée, Napoleon, and Josephine shared a carriage on a 4-hour drive to a dinner hosted by Joseph and Juliette Mortefontaine. Right? Bourrienne was quoted as saying, despite his best efforts, Napoleon could not withstand the Republican firmness of Bernadotte. There was another dinner afterwards, again, where Bonaparte accused Bernadotte of being a member of the Chouans, a group that led a royalist uprising. And Bernadotte responded by stating, only the other day you taxed me with favoring the violence of friends of the Republic, and then he stormed out. So Bourrienne stated that Bernadotte's shrewd penetration made him one of the first to clearly see into Bonaparte's designs. He saw the Directory as divided into two parties, the one duped by the promises and assurances of Bonaparte, and the other convinced of his determination to overthrow the Constitution and possess himself of power. In the days immediately preceding the coup, Bernadotte showed no hesitancy in speaking his mind. Napoleon and Joseph knew that he did not support their, did not know whether or not he would openly oppose them.
1 minute warning.
Thank you. At 10 in the morning on 18 Brumaire, Napoleon gave a speech to the Council of the Ancients in the upper house of the French Parliament. Joseph spent this time trying to locate Bernadotte, who refused to accompany Napoleon that morning. He went to their home. Désirée told him that he was not there. He is eventually able to find him and keeps him with him at home that day to make sure that he cannot intervene. So in the end, Napoleon successfully outmaneuvers his two co-conspirators, and Bernadotte was kept away during those events. The Bernadotte family ended up fleeing Paris to hide in the forest of Sénart. They remained there until Joseph told them it was safe to return. Afterwards, Napoleon asked Julie to host another dinner at Mortefontaine where he could meet with Bernadotte. And Bernadotte replied to him that his sword would always be at the service of France. He claimed that Désirée's family harmony mattered more to him than his principles, and he had been neutralized by his kinship with the first consul's sister-in-law. Napoleon remarked to Bourrienne, saying, "He's honest, but for his obstinacy, my brothers would have brought him over. They are related to him. His wife, who is Joseph's sister-in-law, has ascendancy over him." This strongly suggests that Désirée played a major role in neutralizing Bernadotte before and during the coup. Bernadotte himself later is talking to Joseph about their actions, and he says, "But have I any right to reproach you for not having imitated the grand models of patriotism of which history gives us examples, since I was found wanting also, thanks to the persuasion of Joseph? Why? Because Joseph is the husband of Julie, who is the sister of my wife Désirée. On such trifles depend the destinies of a great empire."
Thank you, Ms. Deluna. Our next panelist will be Claudio Mann. Claudio is a graduate student at the University of North Texas. He is a master's student in history, pursuing his master's degree in Napoleonic history under the advisorship of Dr. Michael Legere. And he will be speaking to us today on Daru and his time during the Directory. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Well, I feel a little guilty to introduce accounting and administration right after these romantic adventures that Christy Deluna was sharing with us, but here we go. So a typical image of a battle waged in the 18th century depicts brave soldiers marching shoulder to shoulder at the sound of drums and fifes, supported by artillery and fierce cavalry charges. Yet this picture, idealized in thousands of books and films, reflects just one dimension of the art of waging war. Behind the scenes, weapons and ammunition had to be produced and distributed, food and fodder shipped to regiments on the march, troops had to be paid, and convoys with medical supplies organized. Alas, archival records have made it easier for scholars to compare opposing armies in terms of their sheer number of troops, cannons or horses, than based on the amount and quality of nourishment that the soldiers received, lodging conditions, or the men's health. Thus, it is not surprising that supply and logistics, a vital dimension of warfare, has been underappreciated by publishers, researchers, and students. The respected military historian, Dr. Martin van Crevel, argues that moving troops and materiel and keeping armies supplied is as crucial as battle tactics. In the same spirit, a popular quote proclaims, "Amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics and sustainability in warfare." Indeed, Far from the front lines, the destiny of armies and generals has been considerably influenced by anonymous bureaucrats working long hours behind the desk. These men were, on many occasions, the actual organizers of victory or the root cause of defeat. This study concerns one such man, Count Pierre-Antoine Daru. The exercise seeks to find signs of an increased professionalization in the French military bureaucracy. Specifically, this research examines his performance as bureau chief at the French Ministry of War from December 5th, 1795, until he assumed his next commission as Inspector of Troops for the Armée of Mayence under General Barthélemy Joubert on September 28, 1798. The analysis concludes that Daru's contributions consolidated his reputation as a first-rate administrator, defining a period of increased professionalism in France's government. Furthermore, he epitomizes a career bureaucrat, his appearance marking the advent of the modern public servant. Daru was able to take greater responsibilities despite losing his venal rights to the office of Commissaire de Guerre that his father had purchased for him at a high cost. His success proves that after 1789, talent had become an important element in determining the prospect of public officials, albeit not the only one. From his first appointment in 1784, Daru had accumulated valuable knowledge of the general principles of army administration and control. By early 1785, at age 28, the Montpellierien had become a seasoned military officer with a solid understanding of the French army's regulations. Furthermore, his experience with the forces fighting insurgents in the Vendée had made him accustomed to working with high-ranking officers such as Jean-Baptiste Aubert-Dubaillet and Claude Petier. They both valued his work ethics and frankness. Petier describes Daru as all that can be expected from a good administrator. A certificate issued by Army headquarters at Rennes praised Daru's dedication to his duties with precision and impartiality. In April 1795, Daru was promoted to the rank of Commissaire Ordonnateur en Chef for both the Armée de Côte de Cherbourg and the Armée de Côte de Bretagne, reporting to General Louis-Lazare Hoche. Daru participated in the action to defeat Charles-Eugène de Sombreuil's forces at Fort Penthièvre in Quiberon Bay on July 20, 1795. Among other missions, he conducted an entire inventory of the materiel captured from the enemy and prepared a comprehensive report for the commander-in-chief. This milestone crowned a period of significant achievements in Daru's army career and placed him among the top French commissaires ready to take greater responsibilities. On August 22, 1795, the National Convention sanctioned the Constitution of Year 3. The government was reorganized and the old ministries re-established. A new executive, headed by 5 directors elected by the legislature, assumed power on November 2, 1795. The following day, the Directory appointed General Aubert-Dubaillet Minister of War. At that time, Dubaillet was serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Armée de Côte de Cherbourg, and in that capacity, he had direct oversight over a portion of Daru's activities. Impressed with Pierre-Antoine's performance in the Western theater of war, the new minister summoned his former subordinate to Paris and invited him to join the ministry on November 13, 1795. Daru, whose family resided in the French capital, promptly accepted the offer and moved to the paternal home at 79 Rue de Lille. His residence was just a few blocks from the ministry, allowing him to work late as it was his routine. Pierre-Antoine's life experienced a major transformation after accepting this new position. From 1795 to 1798, he improved his understanding of the inner working of the government bureaucracy and expanded his circle of influential relations, allowing him to further his career. In addition, while working at the ministry, Daru enhanced his managerial skills, becoming a self-confident and assertive administrator. On a personal level, his status within the family was elevated, and his relatives and closest friends progressively relied on his influence to secure their financial future. Yet Daru faced enormous challenges. Government officials usually manage their bureaus as a personal fiefdom. As a result, although a considerable proportion of state outlays were devoted to sustaining the military establishment, funds were inefficiently used and corruption was rampant. Moreover, accountability was practically non-existent, and the preparation of comptes rendus was an exception rather than the rule. In contrast, Pierre-Antoine distinguished himself from his peers by a combination of dedication, first-hand experience, and integrity. Daru's conscientious accounting and careful stewardship of public funds were atypical. It was, in fact, very risky to oppose economic interests that profited from state contracts. He could only succeed with strong support from his superiors and competent staff. After a few weeks of induction, Pierre-Antoine was appointed chief of the 2nd Division of the ministry on January 5, 1796. Aubert de Baillet redesigned the scope of the division to match the skills of his appointee. Daru commanded a quarter of Minister de Baillet's staff, or the equivalent of the whole Ministry of Justice. Functionally, his unit was responsible for the Bureau de Subsistance, accountable for all matters related to the provisioning of troops on the march, or étape, a subject that Daru had mastered during his service in his native Languedoc. However, the position performed a dual role. Principally, he acted as Secretary General to the minister, handling his official correspondence, processing incoming requests for ministerial consideration, and preparing regular stewardship reports to the Directory and the committees of the legislature. In short, all critical paperwork flowed through Daru's office. Overall command and control was the Directory's prerogative, especially these directors Lazare Carnot and Etienne François Le Tourneur, who worked closely with the topographic service under the direction of General Henri-Jacques Guillaume-Clark. The ministry coordinated and administered, but was not responsible for conducting the war, which fell under the purview of Carnot. This allocation of duties did not satisfy the impetuous Aubert de Baillet. He complained about the heavy reporting burden imposed on him and Carnot's interference in the daily affairs of the ministry. The two men also clashed regarding military appointments and the pace of reform. Carnot had been a candidate for the position of Minister of War and was not fond of de Baillet. Unsurprisingly, shortly after taking over his new responsibilities, Minister de Baillet was reassigned to a diplomatic mission in Constantinople as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And on February 8, 1796, Daru's former boss, Claude Petier, replaced de Baillet. Carnot trusted Petier's skills and integrity. Director Louis-Marie La Révélière-Lepeau was less enthusiastic, expressing that Petier was not assertive enough and could be manipulated. Carnot considered Petier très habile et très honnête, reducing his demands in terms of reporting and meetings. Hoping to restrain budget excesses, the Directory charged Petier with a mission to reduce his staff by 2/3 and lower the agency's costs. Despite the discharge of thousands of men after signing the peace treaties with Prussia, Hesse-Kassel, and Spain in mid-1795, the Ministry of War still had 900 clerks by March 1796. Petier's designation was good news for Daru. By nature, they were both organized, precise, and methodical. As a result, they had developed an affinity, and their working relationship turned into a close friendship despite the 18-year age gap. Indeed, from June 1st to November 16, 1792, Daru had replaced Petier as commissaire ordonnateur et grand juge militaire of the 13th Division after the latter was assigned to the Armée de Centre under General Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. At the time, Petier had confidently endorsed the decision to appoint the 25-year-old Daru to the temporary assignment, and on several occasions he had sent him as envoy on complex missions in his stead. Daru had fully met his commander's expectations and earned his confidence in a brief time. From the start, Daru displayed at the ministry his singular energy and dedication. On February 20, 1796, after only a few weeks at his post, he prepared a comprehensive status report and recommendations regarding the management of foodstuffs, fodder, and other supplies. As part of the exercise, Daru drafted an arrêté ministériel for Petit's signature, creating in every army the position of contrôleur de subsistance. This initiative was received enthusiastically by the commissaires embedded in the field armies. Like most of Daru's work, the document follows a solid logic based on a detailed analysis of past practices, historical records, well-founded premises, and recommendations. For example, in the case of units forced to live off the land in enemy territory, the arrêté barred individual soldiers from marauding for food. Instead, it required commanders to request the local civilian authorities to bring provisions to the French military depot, leaving the responsibility of distribution to the unit's quartermaster. Such concern for the long-term consequences of military actions spoke of Daru's potential as a diplomat and administrator of occupied territories. Napoleon later recognized those skills at Tilsit. Daru also conducted a detailed survey to determine the factual situation of the army. Presented on May 30, 1796, the exercise enabled the minister to ascertain the number of troops under arms. It was slightly over 450,000 men, including officers, compared to a nominal strength estimated at 645,000. Armed with this information, Petit was able to redefine priorities and request cost reduction plans from his subordinates, thus bringing the budget under a semblance of control. Soon after, Daru produced a compilation of all army regulations sanctioned from 1732 to 1795, intending to arm the agency with a solid legal base to regulate the army and support military tribunals. This desire to adhere to the letter of the law was rooted in his personal convictions and experience as a military judge. Consistently, he followed and demanded compliance with rules and procedures. The most enduring legacy of Daru's presence at the Ministry of War was the regular preparation of comptes rendus. These reports, reflecting the origins and uses of funds entrusted to the minister, included careful stewardship of the actions taken during the period and a plan for the following cycle. Submitting an annual stewardship report was a legal requirement imposed on all ministries. However, Petit was among the few to present a regular statement of his agency's affairs. Throughout his tenure at the ministry, Daru applied a methodical approach to running his area of responsibility, relying on the fundamental principles of modern bureaucracy: specialized knowledge, hierarchical structure, clear delimitation of roles and responsibilities, generally used procedures and controls. For instance, Daru prepared a proposal to overhaul the minister's organizational structure. The goal was to increase the agency's efficiency and reduce its annual budget, eliminating unnecessary positions. So these positive developments were not representative of the entire situation. The army was perennially short of supplies, and the bureau chiefs and commissaires, rather than the generals, were the first to receive blame. Yet, despite all difficulties, the achievements of the bureaucratic state must be acknowledged and recognized as a remarkable feat. Without a professional bureaucracy, it was practically impossible to recruit, train, arm, feed, and clothe an army that had reached 750,000 men at its peak in 1794. Furthermore, the mobilization of more than 1 million men over 10 years was unthinkable a few years prior.
1 minute warning.
Okay, so in conclusion, Daru was among the talented members of a new generation of functionaries accepting the challenge of joining the bureaucratic state and making the modern army a reality. His career was a testimony to the benefits of opening all jobs to talent. Diverging somewhat from Dr. Howard Brown's theory, the analysis also suggests that the conflict pitting the state elite against the ministerial bureaucracy might have stemmed from unrealistic expectations placed on the latter by the former. Ideological differences and personal animosities had undoubtedly played a role in the dispute, but extreme pressures from the military conflict opened a large fracture between politicians and public administrators. Interestingly, most accounts of the exploits of the French armies of the late 18th century are devoted to describing their elan, maneuverability, and operational innovations. Yet, as explained, the fundamental distinction between the revolutionary forces and their predecessors was scale. The gradual emergence of a professional bureaucracy was instrumental in making such an expansion possible. Consequently, the hypothesis that the French Revolution gave birth to a competent civil servant that held the keys to successful military policy implementation is supported by credible evidence. Daru, with his remarkable organizational skills and dedication, resolutely contributed to the revolutionary ethic. Let me close with a phrase attributed to General André Massena by the writer Henri Bale, known as Stendhal, in regards to Pierre Daru. Voilà un homme que je puis présenter à mes amis et à mes ennemis. That is, here is a man that I can equally introduce to my friends and to my enemies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Our next panelist is Mr. Nick Kramer, and he will be presenting to us on the Iron Marshal, Davout, and his campaign and the campaign in 1813, and his connection with Oudinot as they face off against von Bülow.
All right, thank you, Dr. Robinson, and thank you everybody for tuning in this morning. All right, so the title of my paper is The Iron Marshal in North Germany, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout's 1813 campaign after the armistice of Clausewitz. In late August 1813, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, launched a campaign to restore French dominance over Central Europe and win the War of the Sixth Coalition. The autumn campaign of 1813 aimed to capture Berlin and knock Prussia out of the war. Historian David Chandler labeled Napoleon's operational scheme to take the Prussian capital before a complete mobilization of his armed forces the master plan of 1813. Although Napoleon devised the master plan for the spring campaign in 1813, Marshal Michel Ney missed an opportunity to seize Berlin after he misinterpreted an order from the emperor to support his efforts at the Battle of Bautzen and marched his entire force south to support Napoleon. For the autumn campaign, Napoleon revived the master plan, a second offensive against Berlin, led by Marshal Nicolas Charles Oudinot and the newly formed Army of Berlin with the support of Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout's 13th Corps from Hamburg. The master plan was more than a simple offensive against the Prussian capital. Napoleon envisioned a strategic envelopment of the main Russo-Prussian army. However, this plan failed, and Napoleon suffered a massive setback in his aim to defeat the Sixth Coalition in 1813. After the armistice of Clausewitz expired on 13 August 1813, Oudinot and Davout marched towards Berlin. The master plan suffered a significant blow when Oudinot suffered a defeat at the Battle of Gross-Bären on 23 August 1813, and Oudinot subsequently retreated to Wittenberg the day after. The coalition's victory at Gross-Bären saved Berlin and provided the Prussian and Allied armies with much needed confidence. Oudinot lost at Gross-Bären due to several factors: rugged terrain, which did not allow for mutual support from other corps, poor communication between friendly forces, and the bravery of the newly established militia in Germany, the Landwehr. Additionally, Marshal Davout and the 30,000 troops of 13th Corps played no role at Gross-Bären and failed to achieve any of its objectives for the campaign. The Iron Marshal was over 100 miles away at Sherwin and did not learn of Oudinot's defeat at Gross-Bären until late August. After Davout received confirmation of the Allied victory, he immediately retreated to Hamburg because he judged that he did not possess the ability to support Oudinot's operation. Davout's 13th Corps was a key component of Napoleon's operational plan to capture Berlin, relieve the besieged garrisons containing French veterans at Stettin, Glognau, and Kirchen on the Oder River, and develop the Allied army. Napoleon envisioned Davout's corps linking with Oudinot's army of Berlin outside the Prussian capital, and marching north to relieve the besieged French garrisons. For this operation to succeed, Davout needed to circumvent General Ludwig-Georg Valmont's 22,729-man corps of German legionnaires, Mecklenburgers, Swedes, Hanoverians, Hanseatic Germans, and Prussians, who blocked his advance towards Berlin. Unfortunately for Davout, poor cavalry hampered his ability to gather proper intelligence about Valmont's strength and position. This forced him to proceed with caution. Therefore, Davout did not reach Oudinot before Gross-Bären. The failure of the Iron Marshal to support Oudinot greatly hindered the latter's ability to conduct a successful operation against Berlin in August 1813. This paper will examine Davout's campaign after the armistice of Clausewitz until his retreat to Hamburg after he received word that Oudinot fled to Wittenberg following the defeat at Gross-Bären. Many writers focus heavily on the actions of Oudinot and place significant blame on his shoulders for the failure at Gross-Bären and the campaign against Berlin. While Oudinot rightly deserves criticism for his setback, he was not the only commander who did not achieve his operational objectives. Marshal Davout failed to play an influential role during the first offensive against Berlin because he lacked the necessary speed and initiative to attack the enemy flank and draw forces away from Oudinot. Therefore, he shares significant liability with Oudinot for the failure of the master plan in August 1813. After the Allied defeat at the Battle of Bautzen on 20 to 21 May 1813, Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich proposed an armistice between the French and the Allies. Napoleon seconded this offer. On 4 June 1813, the two factions agreed to the armistice of Clausewitz, a 6-week truce scheduled to expire on 20 July, but later extended to 10 August with a further 6-day suspension of hostilities. The Allies welcomed the armistice with open arms. Napoleon had driven their forces from the Saale River to the Oder in 4 weeks, a distance of over 200 miles. The Russians desperately needed a break. They had borne the brunt of the Allied war effort in the spring of 1813. This comes after suffering immense casualties during their own 1812 campaign in the defense of their homeland. For the Prussians, the armistice of Clausewitz provided them the necessary time to mobilize the Landwehr, the militia. While the Allies greatly benefited from the suspension of hostilities, it proved to be a tremendous mistake for Napoleon. The French army dealt 2 near fatal blows to the Allies at Lutzen and Bautzen, and the Emperor had an opportunity to capitalize on these victories and crush the coalition. Despite his obvious advantage over the Allies, Napoleon was keen to reorganize his cavalry, rest his army, and secure his lines of communication. During the armistice, the Allies developed the Reichenbach plan, an attritional strategy which focused on attacking lines of communication, avoiding pitched battles, and conducting operations against the strategic rear of the French. After they finalized their operational strategy with the Reichenbach plan, the Allies determined force distribution for their 3 multinational armies in the German theater. After Austria had joined the Allied cause, the Austrian general Prince Karl Philipp zu Schwarzenberg received command of all coalition forces, including the main Allied army, the Army of Bohemia, with 220,000 Austrians, Prussians, and Russians. The Army of Bohemia is also where the Allied sovereigns, Alexander I, Francis I, and Frederick William III oversaw the campaign. The second largest Allied army, the Army of North Germany, with 140,000 Prussians, Russians, Swedes, and North Germans, was commanded by the former French Marshal turned Prince Royal of Sweden, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, while Prussian General Gebhard Lieberich von Blücher received command of the Army of Silesia with 105,000 Russians and Prussians. Finally, an auxiliary corps of around 28,000 men under Valmont covered Davout's force in Hamburg. Unlike previous campaigns, the Allied states did not field independent national armies. They employed
Nick, can you unmute yourself, please?
I unmuted myself. Well, I was muted. Sorry about that. Sorry, 1 second. All right. Unlike previous campaigns, the Allies did not field independent national armies. They employed 3 multinational armies to prevent Napoleon from isolating their forces and beating them piecemeal and to curb any politically motivated acts of self-interest. Valmont's corps acted independently during the campaign despite being under the nominal command of Bernadotte. The Crown Prince instructed Valmont to stop Davout if he possessed superior forces. Otherwise, he was to cover the rear of Bernadotte's army and impede Davout's progress from Hamburg. Bernadotte also dispatched the Swedish general Eberhard Ernst Gotthard von Vegesack with his 6 battalions of Swedes, 3 battalions of Mecklenburgers, and 1 Jaeger, with 4 cavalry squadrons to aid Valmont in this effort. He arranged his corps as followed: a division of Swedes between Ratzenburg and the Baltic Sea, split into outposts at Grevesmühlen, Dessau, and Schornberg and Ratzenburg, and Valmont concentrated his troops under his direct command at Wittenberg, with the cavalry of Major General Dornberg posted at Buchen on the plain of Zarenton. On the French side, Napoleon also reorganized his forces into 3 armies. The Grande Armée, with 225,000 men of the Emperor's command, stood in the center of the French area of operations between Bautzen and Görlitz. Ney covered Napoleon's left flank in Silesia with 3 infantry and 1 cavalry corps. In total, Napoleon had 270,000 infantry and 30,000 cavalry stationed in the center of his line. This gave him the ability to concentrate his left and center against the main Allied army. The third and final group was the newly formed army of Berlin under Oudinot and his 80,000 men supported by Davout's 30,000 strong 13th Corps from Hamburg. Additionally, Napoleon demanded 9,000 men under General Jean-Baptiste Girard to march from Wittenberg and drive on Magdeburg, where it could conduct future operations. Joining Girard were 5,000 Polish soldiers under the guise of General Jan Dombrowski. Girard and Dombrowski had the critical task of not only aiding Oudinot's offensive towards Berlin, but also forming the link between the Duke of Reggio and Davout. Oudinot officially received command of the Army of Berlin on 12 August. Napoleon's orders clearly informed him that he needed to capture Berlin, a task the Emperor fully expected him to do by 21 or 22 August. Oudinot would then push towards the garrisons of Kirchen and Stettin and lift the sieges there. Lastly, the Emperor firmly instructed Oudinot to drive the Swedes into the sea with Davout's assistance. Napoleon placed extra importance on Oudinot's operation against Berlin due to the Austrian declaration of war. After taking Berlin and rescuing the French veterans at Stettin and Kirchen, Oudinot could drive towards the Vistula River and force the Russians to separate from the Austrians. In hindsight, it is easy to label Napoleon's master plan for the autumn campaign as overambitious or reckless, given that it eventually failed. However, it did offer him an opportunity to perform an incredible strategic envelopment of the Allied forces in either Silesia or Poland. Historians have heavily criticized Napoleon's decision to appoint Oudinot commander of the Army of Berlin. F.L. Peter claims that Napoleon made a, quote, fatal mistake in selecting Oudinot for the command of an independent army. He argues that Oudinot was a capable commander of a division or corps, but not an army of 70,000 or 80,000 soldiers. F.N. Maud also condemns the choice of Oudinot, while also criticizing Napoleon's master plan. He asserts that his plan for which to call for Davout to march a great distance to concentrate with Oudinot's army was, quote, an invitation to disaster. Furthermore, the choice of Oudinot puzzled Maud. He argues that Davout and Ney were better choices than Oudinot to command the army of Berlin. Despite Oudinot's lack of experience as commander of an independent army, the supporting 13 Corps from Hamburg featured Napoleon's best field commander, Marshal Davout. The Iron Marshal had distinguished himself several times in the battlefield in previous coalition wars. During the spring campaign of 1813, Davout retook the city of Hamburg from the Swedes and Cossacks on 28 May 1813. Davout spent the armistice building his last command, 13 Corps, from scratch with raw recruits. On 1 July, Napoleon officially named Davout commander of the 13th Corps for operations after the armistice. Many of his 37,514 men were raw conscripts and unreliable Danish soldiers, and he lacked talented senior officers. However, Davout thrived under these circumstances because he was an expert taskmaster and a disciplinarian. By the end of the armistice, he had successfully reorganized, re-equipped, and sufficiently supplied 13 Corps. Davout's military capabilities gave Napoleon confidence in his plan and provided a steady presence for the inexperienced Oudinot. In a letter dated 8 August 1813, Napoleon outlined Davout's role in the offensive against Berlin after the armistice expired. The emperor emphasized that Davout needed to be very active early in the campaign to threaten the enemy flank and protect Oudinot's advance. The success of Davout's operation required him to quickly concentrate his corps on the right bank of the Elbe, 2 leagues in front of Hamburg, and immediately marched towards his objectives the moment he learned the armistice expired. The main goal of Davout's operation was to march between the Baltic Sea and Berlin to meet Oudinot north of the Prussian capital, drive the Swedes from the continent, and relieve the besieged garrison at Stettin, which Davout would hold until the end of October. It is important to note that Napoleon told Davout that he expected Oudinot to reach Berlin by 21 August and quickly retake the city. For Davout, he needed to cover over 150 miles to reunite with Oudinot. While Napoleon did not specify a date or time frame for Davout to reach Berlin, he demanded that he move at a speed so that he was, quote, not neglected. Furthermore, Napoleon called Valmont's force a, quote, lot of scoundrels who once attacked will dissipate. The only way for Davout to know the progress of Oudinot and coordinate a successful meeting outside Berlin was General Gerard's division, which was designated to serve as the link between Oudinot and Davout's forces. On 15 August, Oudinot assembled his corps at Baruth and waited for the armistice to expire on 17 August. On the night of the 17th, Russian and Prussian scouts raided the periphery of Oudinot's army and gathered valuable intelligence. They reported that
warning.
What was that?
2-minute warning.
Okay. They reported that 70,000 men under Oudinot's command occupied Baruth and that Napoleon was in Silesia. After 12 Corps occupied Luckenwald on 18 August, Oudinot called the Council of War with his corps commanders, General Jean Reynier and Henri Bertrand, and the leader of the 3rd Cavalry Corps, General Jean Toussaint Arrighi. During the meeting, they discussed which of the 3 routes to take towards Berlin. The western route via Wittenberg and Potsdam, the center path via Utenberg, Luckenwald, and Trebin, or east through Baruth and Dawson. Oudinot opted to make his primary march towards Berlin along the center route with his 12th Corps, while Bertrand's 4th Corps remained in Baruth to protect the army's right flank. While Oudinot sat and waited for more information to improve and conditions to improve on 20 August, Davout continued his advance. The previous day, he had surprised an enemy detachment at Stenich Bridge and seized it before they could burn it. However, General Louis-Henri Louison could not advance beyond Buchen because the Cossacks burned the bridge he needed to cross. The critical point in Davout's campaign came on 21 August 1813, when Valmont decided to attack him and push him back towards Hamburg. At 5 p.m., they encountered Davout's force encountered General Valmont, and the Allies attacked the French with 6,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry at Arrhenius Goldenbow. Fighting raged for about 4 hours, but by 9 p.m., the French had controlled the field with a loss of 200 dead and wounded on both sides. Davout now occupied the central position between Vegesack and Valmont's corps. This placement presented him with 3 potential courses of action. First, he could march on Sherwin and drive Valmont into the sea. The second option was a direct march towards Berlin to threaten Bernadotte's right flank. This action would require Davout to mass Vegesack's Swedish force at Grabau and continue toward the Prussian capital. The third choice, which is what Davout chose, was to march on Sherwin and await news from Oudinot about his progress towards Berlin.
1 minute.
Okay. On 23 August, Davout entered Wittenberg and occupied Sherwin the next day, and then he halted and solidified his position. The next day, Bülow defeated Oudinot and Reynier at Grossbeeren after a heroic bayonet charge by the Allied troops. However, Davout was nearly 150 miles away at Sherwin, contemplating his next move. Davout did not want to press an offensive towards Berlin until he received an update from Oudinot, which he did not receive until 31 August when he learned of Oudinot's defeat at Grossbeeren and subsequent retreats. Oudinot's retreat totally eliminated the army of North Germany from the strategic picture. Davout was uncharacteristically cautious during his advance from Hamburg. He needed to march with great speed and pomp, to use Napoleon's word, and threaten Bernadotte's right flank. The Iron Marshal failed to achieve any of his objectives for 3 reasons. First, he did not march with great speed to threaten Bernadotte's right flank. Second, he did not have the cavalry required to conduct reconnaissance, a problem that was not unique to Davout, because the campaign in Russia had caused the cavalry arm to virtually cease to exist. Finally, the need to ensure the protection of Hamburg, a vital city for Napoleon's continental system. Therefore, the Iron Marshal deserves significant blame for Oudinot's failure and the French defeat in the early stages of the autumn campaign of 1813, because he failed to impact Bernadotte's right flank and relieve Oudinot of any pressure from the former French marshal. Thank you very much. Sorry about going over the time limit there.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Our last presenter has had a medical emergency, so he will not be able to present his paper, but he did forward his paper. So I'm going to read his paper and then we will have a question and answer period. Okay. Our last presenter today was going to be Paul Dawson, an independent scholar from the United Kingdom. And the title of his paper is An English Republic, Talleyrand in London. And can everyone hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Walking with a stick in consequence of his club foot and standing a little over 5'3" in height, his gray hair curled every day, a man described as, quote, shit in a silk stocking, now enters our story. He is Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the former Bishop of Autun. He arrived in London in January 1792. Talleyrand excited extreme emotions. You either hated him or you loved him. He had considerable charm. Talleyrand ostensibly came to London to prevent England and Prussia from joining Austria in a coalition against France. News of the opening of events in France was greeted with widespread enthusiasm in Ireland and England by sections of society which had supported the Americans in the Revolutionary Wars and had harbored dreams for bringing about a fairer and more just and inclusive republic in England and Ireland. These men and women were largely religious dissenters. Do you still hear the tapping sound, or are we okay? Is this better? Good, okay. When Talleyrand alighted from his coach in the snows of January, he was met by John Hereford Stone, who introduced the former bishop to the Reverend Dr. Priestley, Thomas Paine, Charles James Fox, and Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Talleyrand openly courted a group of British opposition MPs led by Charles Grey, known as the Friends of the People, amongst whom we find redoubtable reformer John Cartwright, as well as nominal leader of the Irish Republican movement, Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Returning to Paris in March without a definite answer from the British Crown, led by William Pitt, Talleyrand persuaded the new foreign minister, Lebrun Tondu, to appoint the young Marquis de Chauvelin as ambassador to London, to whom he was to act as secretary. The two men arrived officially in London on April 29th, just after France had declared war on Austria, with whom Prussia then allied itself. Through skillful negotiation, Talleyrand secured a declaration of neutrality from the British government on May 25th. However, all was not as it seemed. A French émigré working for the British Crown reported that Talleyrand had been observed in the West End of London on the 25th of April. The spy added that word on the street was that the former bishop had been in London for at least 10 days and was working with a shadowy underground movement, the Irish Association. The spy warned, quote, the Bishop of Autun, Talleyrand, and his secretary are in London incognito, plotting with ill-intentioned Irishmen. Our spy, Jean-Baptiste Cruchon, added that zealots gathered to discuss the revolution in France and how to bring revolution to Ireland and England at Madame de Dion's rented house on Piccadilly. Our spy noted to the British Home Office she was a, quote, dangerous person of interest, darkly noting that Madame Dion was sending secret messages to the French. The goal of the Irish Association was to establish an Irish Republic on the French model and to give the same rights to Catholics and religious dissenters as Anglicans enjoyed. In Ireland, Catholics were second-class citizens, denied the right to vote and the right to own property. So too, non-subscribing Presbyterians, better known as Unitarians. 80% of the Irish population, Napper Tandy considered, were little better than slaves. In England, Catholics and Unitarians, around 20% of the population, also found themselves second-class citizens due to the repressive sectarian legislation the Test and Corporation Acts, as well as the Blasphemy Acts, had established. Decades of resentment at the unjustness of the so-called British liberty had led to legal routes to redress grievances being blocked by the British Crown, now led to direct action to overthrow the British Crown. Ireland wanted home rule, and the French were happy to help. Cruchon reported that the Irish Association communicated with the French via messages sent through Amsterdam or The Hague, and were in contact with a, quote, long-established movement in Ireland centered in Dublin and the United Irishmen movement, among whom we find none other than Theobald Wolfe Tone and an agent of both Talleyrand and Thomas Jefferson, the American Thomas Atwood Digges. On the 15th of May, Cruchon reported to the Home Office information the importance to the French regime of the attempt of the bishop, that is Talleyrand, to separate Ireland from Great Britain. Intercepted messages between London and The Hague reported the French would supply £4 million for the Irish to buy arms and pay their army for active service for 3 months. The army in question, without a shadow of a doubt, were the 80,000 Irish volunteers organized by James Napper Tandy. Another document reported that the French Navy would supply 25 ships of the line and 50 transports would transport French reinforcements to Ireland once the revolution had commenced. Events in France now intervened in the planned Irish rebellion. The storming of the Tuileries Palace by the Paris mob on June 20th made his position difficult, and he left London on the 7th of July. The Irish revolt was delayed. The Bishop of Autun returned to London on the 18th of September. Talleyrand was still engaged on Pétion's business and was directly funding reform groups in England, Ireland, and Scotland. His mistress joined him on the 30th. Days after Talleyrand arrived, the spy Cruchon informed the Home Office that he had intercepted a letter from France heading to the Revolutionary Committee in London, which named the lead plotters as Thomas Paine, Archibald Hamilton Rowan, James Napper Tandy, Simon Butler, Germa, and Colonel Sharman, and the latter all being senior members of the Dublin and Belfast United Irishmen. Worryingly, an agent in Liège reported that 400 to 500 Jacobites, that is, Catholic supporters of James II, who was deposed in 1688 in favor of in favor of Irish independence from England and Catholic emancipation, in Brabant, Flushing, and Holland, were preparing to set sail in 2 frigates for the north of Ireland with a consignment of arms. Cruchon added that, quote, the Bishop of Autun, Talleyrand, had organized a suspicious contract placed at Rotterdam for 80,000 firearms destined for Ireland. 10 days later, Talleyrand reported to Pétion that William Pitt's government, quote, was suspended over a volcano. He noted that through his agents, 166,000 had joined the cause in England and 80,000 had been armed and organized in Ireland. He was fostering French Republicans to travel to England as émigrés who would lead the British insurgent force. All was seemingly set for a revolution. Jacobin principles were now cascading to a conclusion, he reported at the start of November to Pétion. Pitt's government was doomed. Yet the revolutionary movement never came. On the 15th of November, Talleyrand requested an answer as to why he had no word of the French fleet putting to sea. He never received an answer. He was declared an enemy of the state in December 1792, and he would not return to France for 4 years. The political factionalism between Robespierre and the Girondins during the trial of the king ended any hope of the French landing. Talleyrand was clearly playing political games. We should not hardly be surprised. This is Talleyrand, after all. Officially, he was assisting the French government to negotiate British neutrality in a war that may occur. The charm offensive, through lavish meals, balls, and receptions, seemed to be working. In case traditional diplomacy failed, Talleyrand was hoping that by promoting social and sectarian division in England, Ireland, and Scotland, British troops would be tied down at home and unable to wage war on the continent. If that insurgent activity resulted in Ireland being liberated from the British crown, as sought by the United Irishmen, then France would have a new ally. If the disturbances in England caused sufficient chaos, then Pitt would fall and Charles James Fox would become premier, and no war would happen. For the radical leaders, it seemed France would bring about revolution and bring their long-held hopes and ambitions for the reformed parliament to fruition, and also an abolition of the national church. For the Irish Catholics, an Ireland free from the English yoke seemed to be within touching distance. The French had found willing allies in Irish Catholics and English dissenting communities, centered on Unitarian congregations. The next decade was marked with Anglo-Irish radicals' dependency on France. The English in rage failed to bring about revolution, not because they were ineffective. The French sent 7 expeditions to England and Ireland in 3 years, but because they could not rally sufficient support for the elite to guarantee success. Okay, so I think our next order of business is to open up the floor to any questions. I do have one question from Dr. Legere, and this question is for Christy Deluna. Dr. Legere asks, were Bernadotte and Joseph Bonaparte, did they have an actual friendship relationship, or were they simply in-laws and brought together because of their marriages?
From everything I've found, that's one of the areas where the historiography seems to remain the same. And that is that they did share political views and that they were friends prior to that, which is part of why Joseph saw Bernadotte as somebody that he could use almost as an ally against his brother at times. Napoleon had a way of being kind of condescending towards Joseph when it suited him. And Bernadotte was, one way of countering that, especially considering the antagonism between Bernadotte and Napoleon.
Do we have any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat unless I'm missing some. I will look to see if anybody's raised their hands. I had a couple of questions for our presenters. For Mr. Mann, my question for you was, when Daru eliminates, you said he eliminated many redundant positions within the government, which is excellent for efficiency. But I'm wondering, was there any backlash from those who lost their jobs? I mean, because it sounds like several hundred people were now out of jobs.
It's an excellent question. And this was a constant struggle. To some extent, the public administration was a revolving door. So it was not atypical to find a change in processes or organization that provided a first decline, if you will, in the number of personnel, but they re-entered the business through contractors, through some other mechanism. So it was obviously, as I was saying, a struggle, but we should not assume that any of these changes became permanent. The administration, again, as we know, later on grew even more so, especially with the consulate and the empire.
Thank you. We do have another question for Ms. Deluna. This comes from Paul Zamanias. Did Bernadotte and Joseph remain friends and or in contact after Bernadotte joined the coalition up against Napoleon?
I haven't gotten that far in my research since I'm just starting, but from everything I can find, they did remain close. I'm not sure that it was after he accepted the throne in Sweden, but I do know up until that point. And even after he accepted the throne in Sweden, Désirée was still very much a part of the Bonaparte family and always with them. So I don't think communication was cut off. And there is documented correspondence between Napoleon and Bernadotte that continued past that time. So you don't have the animosity that you would expect from that break, but I don't know that I could say with absolute certainty that it was a friendship.
Our next question is for Mr. Kramer, and it comes from Frederick Schneid. Can you elaborate on how Oudinot is to blame can you elaborate on how Davout is to blame for Oudinot's defeat? Didn't Oudinot have situational awareness and know what was in front of him? And I think you addressed that in your paper. We just ran out of time. So
yeah, so Oudinot, so a lot of people have labeled Napoleon's scheme as, overambitious because Davout's coming, over 150 miles from Hamburg. But I mean, wait, can you repeat the question again? I got a little confused there.
He asked, hold on, let me go to it. Can you elaborate on how Davout is to blame for Oudinot's defeat? Didn't Oudinot have situational awareness and know what was in front of him?
So, I mean, I said it in the, so Davout was uncharacteristically slow during this campaign. He, earned the nickname the Iron Marshal, for his exploits, at Ian Auerstedt in 1806. He was by far Napoleon's best corps commander. I know I probably shouldn't be saying that at this Massena conference, but I mean, he was brilliant. And during this campaign, he was slow and he wasn't there. Napoleon expected him to be in the picture. And that's why I gave him the assignment. And you would expect Davout to be able to do that, given his track record. But he had inexperienced conscripts. They were untrained Danish soldiers who had never seen combat before, so they weren't his best. And, you read memoirs where, Davout was leading more from the front and he was more tired than usual because he had to take on more of a command role, from the front. And he was, a little bit tenuous. But it is fair to say Oudinot, and David Chandler says this, that Oudinot should never have retreated anyways. He should have continued his offensive towards Berlin anyways. But a lot of people forget that Davout was nowhere to be seen. And Oudinot expected Davout to be there and threatened Bernadotte's right flank. And it's not unfair to criticize Davout for not being able to blast Valmont's corps out of the water and and threaten Bernadotte's right flank. And I think it's important to remember that Bernadotte was scared out of his mind during this campaign. He didn't really want to face the French, mainly Napoleon. So he was tenuous throughout the campaign in general. He was going to give up Berlin anyways, unless, save for the fact of Bülow's, insubordination, if you want to call it, and attacking a Grossbaron. He was fully planned to retreat behind Berlin anyway. So if Davout, eviscerates Valmont's corps and marches towards Berlin, against Bernadotte's right flank, he probably cowers away and runs anyways. But Davout was slow and he played no role in the campaign. So while Oudinot does, deserve a lot of blame because he wasn't really, he didn't really want to be there in the first place. He tried to get himself removed, citing health reasons because he did suffer a bullet wound in Russia. He's trying to get himself replaced. But I mean, half the plan isn't there, and that's Davout. He wasn't there. He played no part in it because he was slow.
Okay, so I have another question for you, Mr. Kramer, from Mike Legere. what could Davout have done differently based on what he knew of the intel that he had, and based on Napoleon's instructions for him? And what could Davout have done differently based on what he knew, based on the intel that he had? What was the extent of Napoleon's instructions for him?
So Napoleon's instructions for Davout was to march out from Hamburg with great pomp, and speed to threaten Bernadotte's right flank. So he had to do that, but he didn't really have the best intelligence, so he didn't really know what was in front of him. But Napoleon's instructions were clear: is you have to move with great speed, and Davout just didn't do that. So while it may be unfair to say that he should have just attacked, but after Golden Bow, he missed an opportunity. Valmaden didn't. He divided his corps. He divided his army, his corps, and Davout just sat there and sat there on 23 and 24 August and didn't do anything. He just waited to hear about Oudinot. He could have, taken the initiative and pressed forward and increased his success afterwards, but he didn't. He just sat there.
Okay, a sort of follow-up to that question. Do you have any idea why Davout was so apparently cautious in 1813? Was it a lack of military intelligence? This question comes from Paul Zamanias, and I wondered that too. I wondered if he wasn't by that point just kind of gun shy.
Well, there are several factors. One, the lack of intelligence, but that plagued all of Napoleon's armies. So all of his corps and throughout the Grand Armée, throughout the entire 1813 campaign. So that was just something they had to deal with. But I mean, you could also point to inexperienced soldiers. But again, a lot of Napoleon dealt with the same thing, inexperienced conscripts. So, but I mean, I was reading the other day, Davout, he was leading from the front. He was, being uncharacteristically, taking more of an initiative from the front, leading, by hand. And he was just kind of tired by that point. And I mean, but you can say that about anybody. But I mean, there were a lot of things going against him, but he just wasn't at his best. You can just point it that way. He wasn't at his best, and he played no role in the campaign. And he was a critical part of that campaign. And he just was not there. He played no part in it.
Okay. This question comes from Frederick Schneid. And he asks, did Davout know all of this? And are we imposing what we know after the fact on this contemporary analysis? Did Davout know that Bernadotte was scared of him and was going to abandon Berlin?
No, we don't know. Davout didn't know. We know after the fact, with Bernadotte's writings and, just how the campaign played out. But Davout didn't know this. So it's unfair to hold it against him. But I mean, again, he never knew because he didn't press the initiative. He just sat there. So if he had pressed the initiative, giving what we know now, then yeah, Bernadotte probably retreats anyways.
I have another question for Mr. Mann. While Daru learned his craft of organization under the revolution, what was his experience working with army contractors during the revolution?
During the revolution, he was commissaire de guerre ordinaire, which is basically an administrative function at the 13th Division in Rennes. This is a position that he assumed in January 1792. And that's when he started to work for Petier. So he started really from a junior administrative position. And at that time, he had to deal with all the contracts related to lodging, foodstuffs, and supplies for the army in the northwest of France. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but that was really his bread and butter. And when he was an apprentice or as we call a premier élève in Languedoc. He was also working at the Intendance of Montpellier, and he was responsible for the military section when his father was subdelegate of the Intendant. So at that time, he also dealt with contractors, dealing with the maintenance of fortresses, and the topic of étape that I mentioned when I was presenting, which is basically all the provisioning of the troops on the march and when they are basically garrisoned.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to 10:30 and the end of our session. I want to thank all of our panelists for their excellent presentations, and thank all of our audience for attending and the questions. And I hope to see you again at another Massena conference. Thank you.
Thank you.